I've always been more of a night owl. While most people would be winding down, I'd be fully awake, and my wife, well, she was usually the one who couldn't sleep either, just lying there staring at the ceiling. It wasn't that we had anything particularly thrilling planned for our evening walks, but sometimes, when the world's asleep, the quiet, the cool air, and the darkness of the woods had a strange kind of pull on me. It made everything feel more real, like the silence held something alive beneath it, something waiting for the moment when everything slowed down enough to listen. A few years back, one of those nights, my wife and I were sitting around, bored out of our minds. It wasn't too late yet, but late enough that most of the neighborhood was silent. I had that restless feeling, that itch to get out, so I suggested we take a walk. No real destination, just wander a bit and clear our heads. She gave me one of those looks, half amused, half irritated. I don't know why, but when I get these late-night ideas, they tend to come across as a little weird, even to her. But she was in the mood to stretch her legs, so she grabbed a small knife from the kitchen. She wasn't afraid of the dark, but, well, you never know in the woods, and off we went. We ended up walking along a canal trail near our place. It's a pretty quiet part of the town, and it's not too far from a heavily wooded area. People don't really go there unless they live around the area. The canal itself is mostly overgrown, and while it's peaceful during the day, at night, it has this eerie feel to it. It's one of those places where the night seems to press in from all sides, making you feel small, like the world's a little too big for you to handle at that moment. I don't know how far we walked, but we were nearing the spot where the trail dips into a small stretch of dense trees when we heard the voices. It was subtle at first, nothing alarming, just a faint sound of what I thought was two people talking. But as they came closer, I realized something was off. The words they were saying didn't make any sense at all. It wasn't like they were speaking another language or even in code. It was more like they were trying to have a conversation, but each sentence was a strange jumble of random words. I'll never forget the rhythm of it, the way they spoke in this calm, almost mechanical way. It was like they were trying to sound like they were having a conversation, but it was all a mishmash. There was no flow to it, no real pattern. It was like someone had taken pieces of random words and put them together in an attempt to sound like they knew what they were talking about. But it didn't make sense. The way they said it didn't sound natural, not even a little. At first, I thought they might be on something. I mean, I'd seen people act weird on drugs before, especially in the woods, but this felt different. It wasn't chaotic enough to be the kind of disorienting behavior you see when someone's high. It was too smooth, too controlled. They weren't stumbling around, they were moving with purpose, walking side by side, their pace matching perfectly. I didn't want to make a scene, so I motioned for my wife to be quiet. We stepped off the trail, just enough to make sure we wouldn't be noticed. My heart started to race a little. It was an instinct I couldn't shake off, that creeping feeling of something being wrong. Something in me told me to stay hidden, to stay still, and just let them pass. My wife, who tends to be a little more cautious than me, stayed close, her eyes scanning the darkness, looking over the shoulder like she was trying to figure out what was going on. I could see the tension in her face. She probably thought I was being paranoid at first, but even she had to admit that something about this didn't feel right. The two figures came closer, their mismatched words continuing, as though they didn't even care who was around. They were dressed in nondescript clothing, nothing that stood out, but nothing that looked particularly out of place either. They didn't have any backpacks, no bags, just walking, just talking. They kept up their strange, jumbled conversation like it was the most normal thing in the world. I couldn't make out any of the words clearly enough to even try to piece together what they were saying. But I didn't want to either. They passed us by, barely a few feet away. The silence between them, except for those strange words, was unsettling. I'd grown up around woods like these, but I hadn't seen anything like this before. It felt wrong, like a dissonant note in an otherwise peaceful scene. The voices were still just a dull murmur in the air, but their presence was suffocating. It was like I could feel their eyes on us, even though they never looked at us. When they passed, neither of them so much as glanced our way. It was like they didn't even see us. They just kept walking the same odd, rhythmic pace. My heart was hammering now, and I could feel my stomach tighten. There was something about them that I couldn't shake off. Something about the way they moved, the way they talked. It just didn't sit right. My wife tugged at my sleeve, her voice barely above a whisper. What the hell was that? I shook my head, not trusting myself to speak. I had no explanation, no clue what that was. I just knew I didn't want to be anywhere near those people. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that even after they were out of sight, something about the whole situation felt wrong. We stood there, frozen for what felt like forever, listening to the strange words that were still faintly echoing in the distance. When they were finally gone, I let out a breath I didn't even realize I was holding. I don't know what it was, but as we continued walking, neither of us said anything for a long time. We didn't go back to the house right away. We kept walking in silence, trying to make sense of it all. Every once in a while, I'd glance over my shoulder, but I never saw anything. No one followed us, no sounds, just the empty night and the usual rustling of trees in the wind. Eventually, the trail led us back to the main road, where the streetlights offered a sense of safety, and the feeling of being watched slowly began to fade. But even then, there was a nagging sense at the back of my mind, like the whole thing wasn't just a random encounter. There had been something off about it. Something calculated, deliberate about the way those two walked, the way they spoke, and how they never acknowledged us. That night stuck with me for a long time, and even now, when I go for late-night walks, I can't help but keep my eyes peeled. Maybe it was just two people out for a late stroll, or maybe it was something else. Either way, I don't think I'll ever look at the woods the same way again. It was a typical night in rural Arkansas, the kind where the world outside feels so quiet it's like the whole place is holding its breath. I grew up living right on the edge of town, where the houses started to thin out and the woods crept in on all sides. It wasn't the middle of nowhere, but it sure felt like it sometimes. My buddy lived a few miles away, and the quickest way to get to his house was to walk along the train tracks. There was something about the sound of the gravel underfoot and the rhythm of the tracks that made it feel like I was the only person for miles. That night, the air was thick with heat, even though it was already late. It was one of those dark nights where you could barely see your own hand in front of your face. No moon, no stars, just a heavy, suffocating dark. The trees on either side of the tracks loomed like massive, silent watchers, and the only thing that broke the silence was the crunch of the gravel under my boots. I didn't mind the dark. I'd been walking these tracks for years, so it was kind of like a second home to me. The woods around here were thick with underbrush, and I was used to hearing the noises that came with it. The rustle of leaves, the scamper of small animals, the occasional owl hoot. Most of the time, it didn't bother me. I knew the creatures around here, the harmless ones, the raccoons, deer, possums. But there was something different about tonight. Something off. I hadn't been walking long when I first heard it. A crashing sound from off to my left, deeper in the woods. At first, I thought it was just a deer or maybe a raccoon. That was normal around here. But then it came again, closer this time, thicker, heavier. My heart skipped a beat. I stopped dead in my tracks and strained my ears, trying to make sense of the sound. It wasn't the light, skittering sound of a small animal. It was a heavy, deliberate crash, like something was pushing through the underbrush, snapping twigs and branches as it moved. It stopped as soon as I froze. I waited a second, the dark around me almost pressing in. I took a slow, cautious step forward, trying to calm myself. The gravel crunched under my boot, and then, there it was again. The sound of something large, crashing through the woods, rushing through the brush. My stomach twisted into knots. This wasn't normal. It was too loud, too aggressive. I stopped walking altogether, trying to breathe steady and quiet, hoping whatever it was would just move on. But no, it came closer. I could hear it moving fast, its heavy footfalls crunching on the gravel right in front of me. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and my throat felt tight. I couldn't see anything. The world around me was black as pitch. I tried to make out any movement in the trees, but there was nothing, just darkness. And then, just when I thought it might leap out of the shadows at me, it stopped. There, right in front of me, no more than a few feet away. I froze. The sound of heavy breathing reached my ears, loud and deep. It wasn't the breath of a deer or anything else I knew. This was different. It was raw and primal. My heart pounded in my chest. I was holding my breath, trying not to make a sound, straining my ears. It was like my whole body was screaming at me to move, but I couldn't. Something told me if I made a noise, if I moved an inch, I wouldn't survive it. The sound of the breathing grew louder. I could hear it snort, loud, like a bull getting ready to charge. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a bear? Something bigger? I didn't know. I just knew that it wasn't supposed to be this close. Whatever it was right there, so close I could almost feel its heat. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. The breathing, the crunching, everything just went silent. For a second, I stood there, my body trembling, my mind spinning. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a shadow shift in the trees. It was gone. Whatever it was, it had moved back into the woods, leaving me alone in the dark. I didn't wait to hear anything else. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I turned and bolted. I didn't care how fast I was going, just that I needed to get away from whatever had been stalking me. The tracks that had always felt so familiar now felt like a death trap, like they were leading me straight into the jaws of something terrible. The rest of the walk to my friend's house was a blur. My legs were moving on autopilot, but my mind was racing. What the hell had that been? Was it an animal? Person? My thoughts ran wild, spinning between terror and confusion. I kept thinking about what I had heard, the heavy breathing, the way it had been so close, how still everything had gotten when it stopped. My head was filled with the thought, this is it. This is how I die. Some horrible monster is about to drag me into the woods and eat me. I finally made it to my friend's house, and the lights inside were a comfort, a small relief at least. But even though I was standing in the warmth of a home, safe and sound, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, that I hadn't just heard an animal, but something else, something bigger, something meaner. The thought of it, whatever it had been, haunted me all the way until I crawled into bed. As I lay there wide awake, staring at the ceiling, I kept going back to that moment on the tracks. The breath, the silence. I wanted to know what it was. I wanted to know if it was just a deer or a bear, something simple that could be explained. But deep down, I knew that whatever had been there with me wasn't something I'd ever want to encounter again. An hour passed, and I finally started to relax, the comfort of the house and the company helping me calm down. The thought of what could have happened on those tracks faded into the background, though I couldn't completely forget it. By morning, the darkness of that night seemed farther away, something that didn't feel so real anymore. The daylight washed it away, but as I stood up to get dressed the next morning, I caught myself thinking about the tracks again, and how I wished I could have seen whatever had been out there. I wish I could have seen how close the deer, or whatever it was, had come to me. I wish I could have seen what it looked like when it snorted and stomped around in the brush. But as much as I wanted that clarity, I also knew it didn't matter. The thing in the woods wasn't something I could reason with. It was just another creature in the dark, out there waiting for something or someone to come too close. And I'd never be walking those tracks alone again, not without something more than just my own two legs to rely on. That night stuck with me. The sound of it, the breath that was too close, the way the woods had felt so alive with something I couldn't see but knew was watching. It was something that reminded me that, no matter how safe we feel, the woods always have secrets they're not ready to give up. It was supposed to be the perfect solo trip in the Boundary Waters Canoe Area, BWCA. A few days alone, disconnected from the world, with nothing but the sound of paddles dipping into the water and the occasional rustle of wildlife around the shore. I had been planning this trip for months, every detail carefully thought out. I'd spent countless hours preparing, checking my gear, mapping out my route. It was going to be an escape, just me and the wilderness. I'd done solo camping trips before, though never this remote or isolated. But there was something about this place that felt different. I arrived at the outfitter's place in the morning, loaded up my gear, and pushed off into the calm, glassy waters. The weather was perfect, cool enough to keep the bugs at bay, but warm enough to make paddling comfortable. I was in a good rhythm, paddling along, moving from lake to lake. I passed through a few portages, each one a little different from the last, but still, the same quiet isolation enveloped me. The first night, I set up camp on a small island, the only one for miles, and it felt good to be alone. There's something peaceful about being so far out in the wilderness. No one around, nothing but the land and the water. But as the sun set that night, something shifted. The wind picked up, a stiff breeze that made the trees sway in eerie, whispering motions. The waves began to lap harder against the shore, the sound rhythmic but unsettling in the darkness. The fire crackled as I cooked my dinner, the flame dancing and casting strange shadows that seemed to stretch too far. I tried to push the uneasy feeling down, telling myself it was just the wind, just my mind playing tricks on me. That night, as I lay in my tent, the wind howled. The sound of the trees creaking in the breeze was almost soothing, but something in the air made me uneasy. You could hear the small creatures of the forest, mice, squirrels, maybe even a raccoon. The sounds of their tiny feet scampering across the ground were faint at first, almost like soft whispers, but then it became more pronounced. It wasn't just mice now. It sounded bigger, like something larger was moving around outside my tent. The rustling grew louder, and the ground beneath me seemed to shift with each step. I told myself to calm down. It was just the wind, or maybe a bear or a moose wandering by. I kept telling myself that, but the noises didn't stop. The sound of paws dragging through the dirt, the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. It was unmistakable, like something was circling my campsite. I strained my ears, heart pounding in my chest, but all I could hear was the sound of that thing pacing outside. It was too much. I grabbed the bear spray from my side and kept it close, even though I knew that in a panic, I wouldn't be able to react quickly enough. Sleep never came that night. I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, my mind racing. Every tiny sound felt amplified. The wind, the trees, the rustling of leaves. It all mixed into one big, terrifying noise that made my mind play tricks on me. My imagination ran wild. Maybe it was just a moose. Maybe it was something more. Maybe it was someone. Maybe I wasn't alone after all. When morning came, I felt like I hadn't slept a minute. The wind had died down, but the air still felt heavy, like something was waiting for me outside. I didn't waste any time. I packed up camp quickly, double-checking my gear and getting ready to move on. I didn't bother eating breakfast. The thought of sitting still for another minute felt suffocating. As I started to load up the canoe, my hands shaking from the cold and the adrenaline still coursing through me, I noticed something strange in the dirt near my tent. 3 arrows were embedded in the ground, perfectly aligned in a row, pointing towards the lake. My heart stopped. The arrows were crude, their shafts wooden and the tips jagged, like something an amateur might fashion in a hurry. But the thing that unsettled me wasn't the arrows themselves. It was the fact that they were fresh. The dirt around them was still disturbed, and I could see the faint outline of footprints leading away from the arrows, heading towards the trees. Whoever had left them had been close, too close. I could feel my stomach turn as a cold sweat broke out across my skin. I didn't think. I didn't even try to reason with myself. I packed my canoe faster than I ever had before, throwing my gear in without any order, desperate to get the hell out of there. I could feel the eyes of whoever had left those arrows on me, even though I didn't know if anyone was still around. I just needed to go. I paddled hard, my strokes quick and frantic, pushing myself through the water like I had a pack of wolves at my back. The portages felt endless, even though I only had 3 to do that day. My mind was racing, my body exhausted from the effort of paddling and carrying my gear. I passed a few people on the way, other canoeists who waved as they paddled by. They were strangers, but at that moment, I felt a fleeting sense of relief seeing someone else out here, someone else who was alive and real. But even their presence didn't settle my nerves. I could still feel those arrows in my mind, still hear the sound of something big moving through the forest the night before. Was I being paranoid? I didn't know, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, watching. I made it to the next campsite by late afternoon, just as the light was beginning to fade. I set up camp quickly, barely looking at the place as I unloaded my gear. I felt the familiar weight of exhaustion settle over me, but the unease didn't leave. I ate a small meal, barely touched the food, and crawled into my tent early, hoping sleep would take me and I could put the events of the day behind me. But it didn't happen. The darkness outside felt too heavy, and I kept listening for the same noises I had heard the night before. The wind was still, and the silence felt too thick, like the world had stopped moving around me. I heard the faintest sound, like the scraping of wood against stone, followed by a crack of twigs. My blood ran cold. It was the same sound I'd heard the night before, only closer now. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sounds came again, louder this time, right outside my tent. I knew those sounds now. The crackle of leaves underfoot, the dragging steps, and then the unmistakable sound of something sharp scratching against the ground. I had no doubt now. Someone was outside. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My heart was hammering in my chest, my hands gripping the zipper of my tent, ready to bolt if I had to. The sounds circled me again, just like the night before. Whoever it was, they were out there. The feeling of being hunted, being watched, it was overwhelming. But this time, I didn't hear the soft padding of footsteps leaving. I didn't hear the rustle of the trees as whatever it was moved off. Instead, I heard something else, a soft thud, and then another, and another. I knew what it was before I even unzipped the tent. 3 arrows. 3 arrows perfectly placed in the dirt, right outside my tent, pointing at the lake. Couldn't breathe, couldn't think. My hands shook as I grabbed the gear and shoved it all into the canoe. I didn't even stop to properly pack. I didn't stop to eat. I didn't stop for anything. I shoved off from the shore, paddling faster than I had the day before, the fear in my chest burning like a fire. The wind had picked up again, but I didn't care. I didn't look back. When I finally reached the outfitter, I didn't even stop to explain. I just handed over my gear, feeling like I could breathe again only once I was in the van, heading for the exit. Took me a long time before I went back to the BWCA, and even then, it wasn't on my own. I've never done another solo trip. I've been back, yes, but with a group of people, and I've never felt the same sense of unease. Nothing strange has happened since, but I can't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for me to make the wrong move. I don't know who was leaving those arrows, or why they were so determined to send me the message. Maybe they thought I was in their territory. Maybe they were just trying to scare me, but whatever it was, I never want to find out again. I had been deer hunting for a few years, mostly in the same spots. It was a routine. Head out early, find a good spot to sit, and wait. The thrill of the hunt is something that gets under your skin, you know? It wasn't just about the hunt, it was about being out there, away from everything, just me and the woods. But this time was different. My friend bailed on the trip at the last minute, and I was left to go alone. Normally, that wouldn't have been a big deal, but this time, things didn't feel quite right. See, the regular area I hunted had been closed off because of a forest fire. I'd grown used to that place, familiar with every trail, every tree, the way the wind shifted through the branches. It was comfortable, but now I was forced to head out to a new spot, a little less known to me, and that nagging feeling at the back of my mind just wouldn't go away. There was something eerie about the forest this time. It was a light rain when I parked the truck, the kind that makes the leaves shimmer, like the whole forest is alive in some quiet way. But despite the peaceful sounds of the rain, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I threw on my gear, checked my rifle one more time, and started heading out. The ground beneath me was soft from the rain, each step sinking into the moist earth. I wasn't rushing, there was no need. The world felt still, almost too still, like I was the only thing alive in the woods. The trees were dense around me, their trunks gnarled and twisted. The path was narrow, barely wide enough for me to move through without brushing against the wet branches. I moved quietly, just like I always did, trying to make as little noise as possible, staying alert for any signs of movement. I came to a small hill, a slight rise in the ground. The forest opened up a little bit there, with some scrubby bushes and a few dead trees. I crouched down instinctively, not because I was expecting anything, but because it felt right. My eyes scanned the area as I slowly crept up, my boots barely making a sound in the damp earth. And that's when I saw it. First, I thought it was a deer. It was lying at the base of a tree, not moving, its body a big brown lump against the wet grass. My heart skipped a beat as I stopped in my tracks. I hadn't expected to come across anything so soon. I squinted through the misty rain, trying to make out more details. But it was just lying there, too still. There was no movement at all. It didn't look quite right, but I couldn't tell why. Something about the way it was laying there bothered me, but I figured it was just a deer that had fallen to a predator or maybe an accident. I crept closer, heart pounding in my chest. Every step was careful, deliberate. The last thing I wanted was to startle whatever was around. It wasn't until I was about 30 feet away that I started to realize that something wasn't right about this whole situation. The fur on the thing's back didn't look quite like a deer's. It was thicker, more matted. It had a shape that seemed off, like it wasn't the animal I thought it was. I moved closer still, curiosity getting the best of me, my mind racing with possibilities. And then it moved. It wasn't a twitch or a slight shift. No, this was sudden. A quick, fluid motion. The brown lump that I had thought was a deer shot upright in one swift motion, its back arching as if to prepare for something. For a split second, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. My mind couldn't process it. What the hell was it? And then, in that instant, the creature looked at me. Its eyes gleamed like two yellow lanterns in the gloom, narrowed and fierce, locked onto me with an intensity one couldn't describe. Its coat was a dull, sandy color, its muscles rippling beneath the fur. The animal's massive paws dug into the ground as it stood there, poised like a predator. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't anything I'd ever seen up close like this. I froze. I couldn't move. My heart stopped, and my brain screamed at me to get out of there. The air felt thick, suffocating. It felt like the entire forest was holding its breath, like even the rain had stopped falling, and all I could hear was my own heartbeat. Time seemed to stretch, and for that 1 second, I felt like the world had gone completely still. Then, just as suddenly as it had risen, the mountain lion, because that's what it was, bolted. It wasn't a slow retreat or a cautious move. It was a burst of speed, a blur of muscle and fur as it shot off into the woods, disappearing like a shadow before I even had a chance to react. It left only the rustling of the bushes, the soft thuds of its powerful legs pounding the earth, and a lingering sense of disbelief. It was gone, and the quiet that followed was almost deafening. The sound of my own breathing filled the air, and I was left standing there, my pulse racing, the weight of the moment crashing down on me. It took me a few seconds before I could even move, my legs shaking as I tried to steady myself. I didn't know what to think, what to do. My mind was still processing the whole thing. I hadn't expected to come across a predator like that. Not so close, not in such an unexpected situation. I didn't know whether I should feel scared or impressed. But as the adrenaline started to settle in my veins, I realized one thing. I was alive. I had just had an encounter with a mountain lion, and I was still standing there, breathing. I took a deep breath, trying to clear my head. The woods around me were still, the rain now just a faint drizzle. My instincts told me to turn around, to leave, to go back to the truck and forget this ever happened. But part of me still wanted to keep going. I had a hunt to finish. It had only been a few hours since I started, but the adrenaline rush made it feel like I'd been out here for days. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. I wasn't about to turn tail and run, but something had shifted. The forest that had once felt so familiar now felt foreign and hostile. I kept moving, slower now, my senses heightened, listening to every snap of a twig, every gust of wind. I kept checking over my shoulder, as if expecting the mountain lion to come back for me. I knew better than to think it would, but the uneasy feeling lingered, a shadow that I couldn't quite shake. The rest of the day passed slowly. I didn't see another animal the rest of my hunt, which wasn't surprising. After an encounter like that, I'd be surprised if anything else was willing to come near. I didn't get my deer, but I wasn't too upset about it. I had something far more valuable, a story, something real. I thought back to the lion's eyes, the way it looked at me, and I realized that I had come face to face with one of the forest's true predators, and it hadn't been afraid of me. That thought lingered with me for the rest of the day, even as I made my way back to the truck. I didn't hurry. There was no need. The encounter had shaken me, but not enough to make me panic. Still, I kept my eyes peeled, my rifle ready, even though I knew the lion was long gone. I thought about the woods in a different way now, about how they hold so many secrets, about how things can shift so quickly from peaceful to dangerous. And when I finally reached the truck, the weight of the experience finally settled in. I didn't tell anyone about it at first, not because I was scared or embarrassed, but because I knew they wouldn't understand. They'd think it was just a close call, just a freak encounter. But I knew the truth. The woods are full of dangers you don't always see coming. The mountain lion wasn't just an animal in the woods. It was a reminder that we're all vulnerable out there, no matter how prepared we think we are. The next time I went out hunting, I wasn't as quick to relax. I wasn't as sure of my surroundings. But that's the thing about the woods. They'll always keep you on your toes. And sometimes you don't have to catch a deer to walk away with a story. We used to walk in the woods almost every day. My friend's house sat just on the edge of a forest, and it was like the trees were calling to us. Always so close but so far, tangled with trails that seemed to go on forever. It was the kind of place where the sun barely touched the ground through the thick canopy, where the air smelled rich with pine and damp soil. We never tired of it, no matter how many times we went out there. It started off simple enough, just the two of us walking along the worn paths, talking about whatever was on our minds, letting the sounds of nature fill the space between our words. Birds would flit overhead, the occasional rustle of leaves signaling the movement of a squirrel or something else small in the underbrush. That was the usual sound of the woods, the natural hum of life going about its business. But over time, something strange started to creep in. At first, it was subtle. One day, we both heard it. A faint, rhythmic sound, footsteps, coming from somewhere nearby. We stopped and turned to see if anyone else was walking in the woods. But there was nothing, not a single person in sight. We shrugged it off, assuming it was the wind or something we hadn't noticed before. But the next day, it happened again. We both heard the footsteps, only this time they were louder, clearer. They sounded like someone walking alongside us, just a little behind. We stopped. The footsteps stopped. The silence was overwhelming, too sudden, too complete. We looked around, scanning the trees and the ground, trying to catch a glimpse of something, anything that could explain it. But there was nothing, just trees and more trees. The air felt still, like even the leaves had paused. "Did you hear that?" I asked. "Yeah," he replied, his voice a little too quiet, like he didn't want to say it out loud. "Let's keep moving." And so we did. But the next time we started walking again, we heard it again. Footsteps, matching our pace exactly. If we sped up, they sped up. If we slowed down, they slowed down. If we stopped walking, it stopped too, perfectly synchronized. It was like we weren't alone in the woods, but every time we turned, we saw no one, not even a shadow. I started to feel uneasy. It was something I couldn't explain, this constant presence, this thing walking with us. It wasn't like an animal's steps. It didn't sound like a squirrel or a deer. It wasn't the same rhythm. It was too human, too deliberate. But whenever we looked around, we saw nothing. Just trees and empty space. After a few weeks of this, it became normal in a way, almost like the sound of the wind rustling the leaves or the call of a distant bird. But still, it gnawed at the back of my mind. Something wasn't right. We didn't talk about it much because every time we brought it up, it felt like we were acknowledging something that wasn't supposed to be there. But we both heard it. Every time we walked together, we'd hear those footsteps. One day, we were deep in the woods, farther than we usually went, when the sound of footsteps started again. This time, though, it was different. There was something off about it. It wasn't the same rhythm as before. Felt closer, more intense. We both froze in place and looked around, scanning the woods, trying to make sense of it. We listened, the air thick with the sound of our breathing, the only other noise being those footsteps, slowly growing louder. We waited. The footsteps stopped. "Is there someone out there?" I asked. He shook his head. "No, no one is out here." It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the footsteps stopped completely. But there was no relief. There was only the unsettling feeling that whatever it was still there, watching us. We looked at each other for a long moment before turning and walking quickly back toward his house. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the sound of footsteps behind us seemed to follow in perfect step, too. We didn't stop again until we were safely at his door. After that day, I don't know why, but I started avoiding the woods. I made excuses. I was busy with school. I didn't feel like walking, but the truth was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting out there, something that walked the same path we did, but with an intent I couldn't understand. My friend kept walking, but I was too shaken to join him. Months went by. The weather changed, the leaves turned colors and fell, and still, the thought of walking back into those woods gnawed at me. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that it was just the sound of animals or maybe the wind playing tricks on us. But I knew deep down it wasn't. I knew it wasn't just animals. There was something in those woods, something that was walking with us, as if it were just another part of the landscape, another shadow in the trees. Then, one day, 2 years later, something happened. We were walking down the road instead of in the woods, just catching up after not having spent much time together lately. It was a warm day, the air dry and crisp with the change of seasons, when we heard it, the footsteps. But this time, they didn't sound like they were in the woods. They sounded like they were right there, off the side of the road. We both froze, just like we had so many times before. It was the same rhythmic, human-like step, following us. We both glanced over into the woods on the left, where the sound seemed to be coming from. And that's when we saw it. A tiny bird, no bigger than the palm of your hand, hopping along the forest floor. It was moving in time with our steps, bouncing along through the fallen leaves, its little feet tapping the ground with a pace that was unmistakably human. It was hopping exactly at walking pace, mimicking our movements step for step. We both stared at it for a long moment, the realization dawning on us. It wasn't some unseen thing walking alongside us, but this tiny, 4-inch bird, hopping in the leaves with perfect timing. It didn't make sense at first, but the longer we watched, the clearer it became. The bird didn't belong to my woods, but it lived in his woods, always hopping in the exact same pattern. Every time we went out there, it was like a secret rhythm of nature, a bizarre coincidence that no one had ever bothered to notice before. That day, something changed in me. The anxiety I'd felt about the footsteps disappeared, replaced by a strange sense of calm. We'd spent so long worrying, wondering about the unknown, about something that seemed so threatening, when all along, it had been a tiny bird hopping through the forest. The sound of footsteps that had plagued us for years had just been the bird keeping its pace, hopping through the leaves at the same rate we walked. We laughed about it, realizing how foolish we'd been, worrying for so long over something so small and innocent. It wasn't a presence in the woods. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't anything sinister. It was just a bird with its own little rhythm, living in the woods alongside us, without us ever noticing it until that moment. It was a simple thing, but it gave us a sense of peace. The next time we walked in the woods, we listened carefully, but this time we weren't afraid. We knew what the sound was now, and it was no longer something to fear. The bird was still out there, hopping in the leaves, walking with us. Only this time we were listening for it, not dreading it. For the first time in 2 years, the woods didn't feel so unsettling. They felt like a place we could belong. We weren't being followed anymore. We weren't being watched. We were just two people walking with the rhythm of nature, and for once, that rhythm made perfect sense. And in that quiet, simple moment, I realized that sometimes, the things that scare us are nothing more than misunderstandings. What had once been the sound of something stalking us turned out to be the sound of life, something so small, so innocent, that we couldn't see it for what it really was. It was just a bird, hopping in the woods, keeping pace with us. And that, in the end, was the answer we'd been looking for all along.